Ready? Okay. All right. Welcome. I don't know if I need this, but I do because even with this, you'll go, huh? So I think I know pretty much everybody here, but I'm Kelly Keller, at Center for Faith Studies, and tonight's Wednesday Night Alive in the Commons. We have a very special guest with us tonight, Chris Hedges. It's not every day that you get to be this cozy with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and well-respected author like this. So this is like totally cool. So I just want to thank you all for being here. And as far as introducing Chris, I guess I just kind of already did a little bit. But Chris's newest book, you want to hold that up for us all and be our Vanna, is Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative for Revolt. And he will be talking more about that book tomorrow night. Tonight is just the Wednesday Night Alive in the Commons. The idea behind that is shorter presentations, more cozy, more interactive kind of thing. And I do encourage you to get up at any time and get more snacks and to use the restroom or get more coffee or water. But yeah, we have with us tonight, we just thought that would be a great thing if we have a Center for Faith Studies speaker on Thursday, to see if we could get 2 for 1 and have a countryside moment with our CFS speaker, whereas the crowd comes tomorrow night and it's less able to allow for extended conversation. So I asked when I invited Chris and told him about tonight, I said, and talk about what you want. And I understand you're going to talk more about prison, your work with prison ministry. And just by way of introduction, I remember reading one of Chris's books a few years back. And then when I came here, Chris Alexander handed me Losing Moses on the Freeway. And, and I really appreciated that book for its honesty about the ideal when it meets the real. And how we can talk really eloquently about meeting Jesus in the street until you realize that sometimes that's not easy and, in fact, can become very risky to your own safety. And so what do you do with that? And so I really appreciated that as far as you're being vulnerable to in your book on that. So Chris has written many books. He's an expert on so many things. I'm going to turn it over to him here in a second. But one more story. I was talking to the person who's interviewing you tomorrow at KOS, and I said, how hard is this? You've got 7 minutes to interview this man. And I can think right now of 4 topics that were just on NPR that you could easily talk to him about for like 2 hours. He goes, yeah, tell me about it. That's what I'm doing tonight, is trying to figure out what I'm going to do. So he is an expert on so many things and just a wealth of experiences that you're so generous to share with us. So thank you for being here, Chris.
Thank you. So I was overseas for 2 decades as a foreign correspondent. I worked for the Dallas Morning News for 5 years. I was a freelance reporter before that, covered the war in El Salvador, and then went on to the Middle East for 7 years, spent 15 years as a foreign correspondent with the New York Times, was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and then covered the war in Bosnia for the New York Times. I was the Balkan bureau chief, and then later the war in Kosovo. And would come back periodically to the States, but only for a few weeks. And half of my family is from a very rural part of Maine. And I would go up and stay in a house on top of an 800-foot hill that had no cell phone or internet service and just walk in the woods. And so by the time I actually moved back to New York, I had very, very little contact with the country for 2 decades. And that, I think, gave me a window into how dramatically it had changed since I'd been gone, and triggered a series of books that looked at unfettered capitalism and what it had done. Much of my own family comes out of the working class and now lives in these impoverished, virtually abandoned mill towns in Maine. And I remember, those towns when I was a boy and those mills were operating and what they are now. I mean, the town my grandparents are from actually has a strip club now in the middle of the town that was just unthinkable. And a friend of mine who is the head of the history department at the college in New Jersey was teaching in the prison system in New Jersey. And at that point, there was no, they would do GED training, but there was no program beyond high school, no courses for people who had finished the GED. And so she was teaching college level courses to prisoners, and she had a hard time getting other people to do it. And so I started with her, and we would teach semester-long courses. They wouldn't get credit. We'd print our just homemade certificates for them when they finished, if they did all the coursework. We bought all of the books ourselves out of our pocket. And I found myself kind of thrust into the middle of this system of mass incarceration, which I knew very little about. And we have since, over the last decade, built a program whereby prisoners now get college credit. As a matter of fact, in the prison that I usually teach in, it's a maximum security prison. We're about to graduate our first class and they will have an associate's degree, about 30 of them. I told all the other teachers we have to go borrow gowns and hoods and make it look just like a graduation at the University of Nebraska or somewhere. So I think if you haven't been in the prison system, it's almost hard to imagine what happens in it. First of all, the use of solitary confinement. 75,000 Americans are held in prolonged solitary confinement, which drives most people, insane. I mean, you break down psychologically. And if they are seeking to punish a prisoner, or if they want information that they think a prisoner has, then they will ramp it up, so there'll be extreme light and then total darkness, extreme heat, extreme cold. They put them in something called dry cells where they have no water in their toilet, or they have to ask a guard. I mean, it's and only 6%, 94% of people in our prison system never get a trial. They're forced to plea out. Of course, 60+% are poor people of color. And what the police will do is stack them with a series of charges, half of which they didn't commit, and then they will negotiate. The prosecutor will negotiate with a public attorney who may spend 10 minutes with the client, and then you'll get a plea deal. If you go to court, especially if you can't afford an attorney, your attorney doesn't have the time, and they're overloaded with work, and you'll almost always be hit with everything. So the students that I teach that have the longest sentences are the ones who actually often were innocent and attempted to make the court system work. And there's a kind of perverse logic to that, in the sense that if people who don't plea out actually go to trial, you have to give them a stiffer sentence so that they can be an example to everyone else as to why they shouldn't go to trial. Michelle Alexander, who wrote that great book, The New Jim Crow, which I think is really a fine work, is now advocating everyone should go to trial because the system would just collapse. But it's what happens in the prison. I have a student I've taught several times. He was picked up at the age of 14. He was in a gang. He was homeless. His stepfather had beaten his mother to death, and actually he held his mother's head as she died on the floor. And then he was just homeless, living on the streets. He became involved in a gang. There was a knifing. Someone was killed. He says he didn't do it, and I am pretty certain he didn't do it. He was picked up. The police just grabbed him, hauled him into a police station, kept him in there till 2 in the morning, wouldn't let any friends or relatives come until he signed a confession. He was crying. He wanted to go home or go out, go back to where he was living. And on the basis of that confession, he was tried as an adult, and he's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. I have another case of a guy who was the welterweight boxing champion on the U.S. Army boxing team. He was about to go pro. He got picked up for a murder he didn't commit, and what they do is they clean up low-level drug users as informants, and on the basis of these informants who have themselves records and are cooperating with the police in order to stay out of prison themselves, he did go to trial. There's another perfect case. And they actually offered him a plea of, it was very minimal, like 4 years or something, and which he didn't take. He went to trial, and he got a 30-year sentence. Some of the people in there, of course, did commit the crimes that they were charged with. But, of course, the sentences themselves, especially with the 3 strikes you're out law, is insane. I mean, I taught in the Supermax prison last summer a course on Shakespeare, and one of my students has life plus 55, and he never committed a violent crime. It's all drugs and weapons possession. And they have no lawyers, but they don't have money, they don't have resources. There's no way that they can fight it. Increasingly now, with plea agreements, you're seeing the prosecutors force the defendants to sign statements saying that they won't appeal. So they essentially give up their right of appeal. And then what's happened inside the prison system is that for-profit corporations are preying upon this captive population and their families. So phone rates are 5 or 6 times higher than they are outside the prison because it's run by Global Tel-Link or other private phone companies. The commissaries have all been privatized. And I got a list of commissary prices from 1996 and compared them to today. And in most cases, we're talking about basic items, soap, shaving cream, toothpaste, that kind of stuff, all raised by over 100% in most cases. The problem is that the pay that they make, according to the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished except for those who were incarcerated. So prisoners in New Jersey make $1.30 a day for 8 hours of work. That's $28 a month. And what we're seeing now with pressure from commissaries that are run by corporations, like JPay. So it used to be that you could send a money order to somebody who was incarcerated. Now you have to do it through a private money transfer service, JPay being one of the biggest. And if you send $20, they stack on a commission of $4.95. Now we're talking about families that have lost often their primary wage earner and are living in tremendous economic distress. One of the things that angers me so much about the exploitation of the phone service is that most children who have parents who are incarcerated, the only way that they can speak to their parent is through the phone. And all of those phone services you have to pay in advance. So especially for fathers or mothers who want to speak to their children, it's costing them a few $100s a month, which they don't have. These private commissary companies are putting pressure or working with prison officials to withdraw standard issue items, for instance, shoes. So if you go into the prison in New Jersey, you're not issued shoes, you have to buy them, and the commissary, a pair of Reeboks costs $45. They are now increasingly imposing fines on people in prison. So if you have a member of your immediate family who is either dying or you would like to do a viewing after they have died, you get 15 minutes, but you have to pay the overtime for the guards that take you shackled, which can run up to $900. So what you're seeing increasingly, and of course anybody who has outstanding warrants, the money accrues interest. It doesn't matter how long you're in prison. So people are leaving prison now thousands of dollars in debt. And oftentimes they can't get work, especially with a felony conviction. And if they can't service that debt, then they're put right back in the prison. So some of these shootings that you've seen, for instance, the guy who was stopped for the broken taillight, remember he got from the car and ran, he was shot in the back and killed. He ran because he had outstanding warrants, and it meant that he would go right back into prison. That's why he ran. We're also have been seeing in the last few years the establishment by for-profit corporations, including major corporations like Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, Starbucks, McDonald's, who are moving into prisons and setting up what are little more than sweatshops within prisons. Over 1 million prisoners now work for-profit corporations. And they can't strike, they can't complain about their working conditions. The punishment, if there is punishment to be meted out for whatever reason, they can be shipped off to solitary, and of course these corporations don't have to pay benefits. And then there's violence. Violence is endemic within the U.S. prison system. It's estimated that 200,000 prisoners a year are raped, but that's not an isolated act of rape. That's ongoing rape, where usually younger prisoners who are called fish are dominated by predators for sexual services. Beatings are common. In one of the prisons a couple weeks ago, we had a 28-year-old who was beaten to death. They returned his body to his family and told his family that he died of a heart attack, even though I saw the pictures of his body where the contusions and, it was clear that he had been badly beaten. And the family said, well, we'd like an autopsy, and the state said it costs $4,000 to have an autopsy. So all they could do was take pictures of his body and bury him. The investment that corporations have now made in the prison system means that they have a very powerful lobbying group which is dedicated to maintaining this massive prison population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. We have 5% of the world's population. And if you go on Corrections Corporations of America, which is a private prison complex, they mostly work with ICE. But they have these private prisons, and they say that we're a good investment on their website because there's 64% recidivism, meaning that there's an endless supply of bodies. One of the things that is kind of counterintuitive about working in a prison is that you kind of find the worst and the best. I've had a couple people in my classes who should not be walking the streets, but they're psychopaths or sociopaths or, they're mentally disturbed. And then you find these just utterly magnificent, amazing human beings who, may have done something rash or stupid as an 18-year-old or may have done nothing and are sitting in prison for decades. And I think what's so powerful for me is how hungry they are to learn. How, one of the things about running a classroom in a prison is that it's the only time they're not treated as a prisoner. I mean, I never refer to them as prisoners. I refer to them as my students. The man who's now 39, who was 14 when he was charged as an adult, and he met me after the last class, last semester. He waited till everybody left the room, and if I even mention a book, he'll get it. I worked with a local bookstore to help them build a library of 1,000 books, which we brought in, but he was my only A plus, and right before when the bell goes off, they've got to move or they get a charge. So it was right before the bell went off, and he said, he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I can because one day I want to be a teacher like you. I helped my class last year write a play. I did a course on drama, and so I was teaching August Wilson and Leroy Jones, Dutchman, and McNally, who was a great African-American playwright, Baldwin. And as an experiment, I said, well, each week I'm going to have you write scenes, dramatic scenes, just like we're reading, out of your own life. And so I had 28 students. I brought home the first stack of papers, and the papers always have this kind of strange, musty smell of the prison. And I'm reading through, and I get, to the third or fourth scene, and it's brilliant. And then I read on, find another one that's brilliant. And what had happened is I had attracted probably the 4 or 5 best writers in the prison. And a couple more weeks went by, and my wife was an actress. I said, I might be able to do something with this. So I was supposed to be writing this book, but I dropped it. I didn't tell my publisher I dropped it. And I added another night. I could only add another night, according to the prison administration, if my students needed remedial help. So I could file a list of those students that needed remedial help and go in on a Friday night. So I wrote down that the whole class needed remedial help. And I said, well, they asked. I said, no, you're all gone. And I spent 4 months cobbling together this play, which is called Caged, which we're talking with theater people in New York about putting up. And it was, it was raw and it was real. I remember one night I said to them, all right, for next week, I all want you to think of a moment, not a dramatic moment even, or a moment of high drama or anything. I want you to think of just a moment when you had a conversation with your mother. And when the class was done, one of my students came over and said, well, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, Timmy, that's what you have to write. So Timmy wrote this scene, which was autobiographical. He was a product of rape, and he was in a car with his half-brother, and it was pulled over by the police, and his half-brother had a pistol in the car. And if the police search the car and find the weapon, which they did, and no one in the car claims the weapon, then they're all charged with weapons possession. And Timmy told the police, it's mine. And what he wrote was the phone call that he made to his mother from the jail, which said, it doesn't matter, Ma, I wasn't supposed to be here anyway, and you have the son you love. That's why he's in jail. And I knew I couldn't perform the play because it's critical of the system. And so I invited the great theologian James Cone, whose book, The Cross and Lynching Tree, is a masterpiece, to come with Cornel West and to be our audience. And when we got to the prison lobby, this is classic. In prison, it's completely arbitrary how things work. We were met by the warden, and the warden said, well, you're not going to your classroom, you're going to the chapel. So we were all directed to the chapel, and in the back was a phalanx of about a dozen corrections officers, including the major, who's the highest uniformed official in the prison. And there was no way that they could read that play in its entirety in front of the officials because of the retribution that would be carried out against them. So they all kind of huddled and decided which parts they could read and which they couldn't. But that part with Timmy was read, and Timmy read it. And when the play was done, I looked around and Timmy wasn't there. And I said to the other students, where is he? And these guys, all they ever do is lift weights, so I kind of look like one of the munchkins, among them. They're huge, a lot of them. And they said he's in the bathroom, and I found him. This was the first time he had ever spoken publicly, in public, about this. And he was just huddled up in the corner, shaking and weeping, 6'4", black guy. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible injustice that we've done to them. And they've been so effectively demonized, especially by these reality prison shows. I mean, my experience in a prison is teaching Baldwin or Black Boy or August Wilson, which doesn't make for good reality TV. Not that there aren't people in there. We call them gangbangers. I mean, not that they're not there, they are. But there are so many people there who have such integrity, intelligence. I mean, I've taught at Princeton, I've taught at Columbia, I've taught at New York University, and I can take my 3 or 4 best students out of any of those classes, and they can bury any kid at Princeton. But they never had a chance. They never had decent schools. They never had secure home environments. They never had opportunity for employment. I always teach books about power, systems of power, empire, so that they can begin to understand the structures that exist and how those structures are stacked against them. Because, of course, in this society, you're taught, especially if you're poor and marginalized, that you are to blame for your own oppression. So last spring, I taught a course on conquest, and we read The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, and C.L.R. James's great work on the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in human history, Black Jacobins. And I had given my students a syllabus, and there was a Wednesday on the syllabus when I wasn't there. I was speaking in Montana. And I got a phone call in my hotel room in Montana, and they said, this is the Special Investigations Division from the Department of Corrections from the state of New Jersey. Do you know that your students just led a sit-down strike in the Rahway prison? And we think you're behind it. And it was really moving because, they said you can't go back into the prison until you come in for a meeting, which was really an interrogation. But what was moving is that here was this act of defiance over unfair conditions within the prison, but they all knew there was no escape, that act of defiance would be met with the kind of draconian forms of repression and reprisal but they stood up anyway. And of course, they did strip search all the cells, interrogated all of my students, found the two ringleaders, and sent them off to Southwoods, which is a horrible prison in southern New Jersey, and they're in solitary confinement. And I was interrogated. I went back. I had to go in early, and it was a white house, nondescript house with no sign or marking on it across the street from the prison, and I was interrogated for an hour and a half. I mean, was well prepped. I'd been a war correspondent for 20 years, so I'd spent most of my life being interrogated by not very bright police or military in just about any country you can name. And they let me back in the prison. When I got into the classroom, first of all, they never thought they'd see me again. But what was evident was how much trauma they had experienced, because just at the whim of an interrogator or a corrections officer, they could have been thrown out of that college program, sent to solitary confinement, lost their job. I mean, there's so many, you have so little, but what you have is so precious. All of that could be, it was complete silence. I think I had understood that they lived under stress, but it was after that moment that I understood how much stress they live under. And, you know, because they have nothing, and I'm aware that they have nothing, it's the little things they do that's so moving. And one of the students said, well, before class, we're going to make you a cup of tea. Now think about it in a prison. You have to get a tea bag, and you have to boil the water. None of this is easy. And they went out, and they came back, and the student gave me a cup of tea. When I brought, I'll end here, but when I brought Cornell, who I love, and James Cone, who's also an incredible person, into the prison, especially Cone, who grew up poor, and parents never went beyond 7th grade, worked as sharecroppers. His father was a woodcutter, segregated Arkansas. In the summers, he had a burlap bag over his shoulder picking cotton. And I saw Cone, when he addressed my students, he saw himself in those students. And the night after Cornell and Cone came, I had my last class. And one of my students, who had spent 11 years on death row, stood up at the beginning of class, and he turned around to the other students and he said, well, you may have seen that I was crying last night. I've been in the prison system since 1984, and the night that Dr. Cone and Dr. West came to speak to us was the only happy night I've ever spent in prison. And he sat down. And those students, on their own initiative, at the entrance to the classrooms where we teach, they put up pictures of Dr. Cone and Dr. West, because that's who they all want to become. So those are my students. Thanks.